In today's story, we meet George, a 60-year-old man who finds himself navigating a new chapter of life. After years of working on his farm in Willow Creek, George moves to the city and takes on a quiet job as a security guard. But life in the city isn't as simple as he thought. As he forms unexpected bonds and faces new temptations, George's journey takes a surprising turn, reminding us all that no matter our age, life can still hold unexpected twists. Stay tuned for a tale of connection, longing, and the choices we face in our most vulnerable moments. George, at the ripe old age of 60, had been working as a security guard for over 6 months now. It wasn't exactly backbreaking labor compared to his days toiling away on his farm in Willow Creek. He was a sturdy man, built for outdoor work, his face weathered by years of sun and wind. His hair had mostly turned silver, but his beard still held on to its color, giving him a distinguished, almost imposing air. George had seen his fair share of hardship. He had served in the local militia back during the war, his youthful spirit tempered by the realities of combat. Now, decades later, city life still felt strange to him. He had only been to Chicago a handful of times, usually for brief visits or when his nephew Chris had convinced him to come for a weekend. It was during one such visit that the security guard job came up. Chris, a young man full of big city energy, had mentioned that his company, Market Research Inc., was looking for a new guard. They had been robbed recently, and the young guys they had hired before hadn't lasted long. Jennifer, the company director, was now looking for someone older, someone reliable to watch over things. Chris, sensing an opportunity, had nudged his uncle. "What do you think, Uncle George? You'd be great at it. The pay is pretty good, too. You could live enough to last you all year back home." It was more money than George could have imagined making on his farm, where he struggled to make ends meet. Still, he hesitated. Who would take care of Susan, his wife, and the farm? But Chris was insistent, mentioning that the company was desperate. They needed someone to stay overnight and keep an eye on things. It wasn't a demanding job, mostly just keeping an eye on the parking lot during the day, opening the gate for visitors, and making sure everything was locked up tight at night. Besides, Market Research Inc. wasn't a big, bustling company. It was a small operation with a quiet office, so there wasn't a lot of pressure. George, his mind auroral with possibilities, decided to give it a try. He'd work for a month, and if it didn't feel right, he could always go back to Willow Creek. And so, George packed a small bag and accompanied Chris back to the city for a trial run at Market Research Inc. Little did he know, this trip would lead to some unexpected turns in his life. 6 months had flown by, and George had only been back to Willow Creek once, for a too-short visit with Susan and the grandkids during the Thanksgiving holiday. City life was growing on him, and the pangs of homesickness weren't as sharp anymore. He remembered his first night away, how he had barely slept a wink. He had dozed off in a chair in the office, the hum of the old ceiling fan doing little to drown out the unfamiliar city noises. It was strange being away from Susan, from the familiar rhythms of the farm. But the days settled into a routine, and he found himself getting used to this new life. Market Research Inc. was a modest enterprise. The office, housed in a rented 3-story building, sat nestled in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. It was a bit of an eclectic mix of architectural styles, with newer houses rubbing shoulders with older structures. The area had sprung up around a decade ago, mostly government officials who had been granted land and then built homes to live in or rent out. It wasn't a bustling commercial district, but had enough cafes, restaurants, and small shops to cater to the locals. At the end of the street, a small hotel did a brisk trade, especially during lunch hour and on weekends. The office itself had a small parking lot out front, shaded by a colorful bougainvillea. A narrow path around the side led to a small kitchen at the back. The first floor housed a reception area, a few desks for the staff, and a more private office where Jennifer, the director, worked. She also had a spacious room on the top floor, complete with its own bathroom, a plush carpet, and a large, comfy-looking sofa. Behind the building was a rooftop terrace, usually empty except for a few odds and ends and a large water tank for the building. On one side of Market Research Inc. was a small packaging factory, its machines humming away most days. On the other side lived a quiet couple, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. He was a government clerk, and she was a teacher. George had taken note of all these details. After all, who knew what surprises this new life might hold? A week into his trial, it seemed Jennifer had already decided George was a keeper. His age, which he initially saw as a disadvantage, turned out to be an asset. She appreciated his quiet diligence, his reliability. With George watching over things, Jennifer could rest assured her company was in good hands. Jennifer, the director of Market Research, Inc., was a woman in her early 40s. George knew she was married. Her husband, Mark, was away in England, pursuing a postgraduate degree. They had a daughter, Sophia, who would soon be starting second grade. That was about all George knew about his employer's personal life. He was a man of simple means and humble origins. He had a few grandkids of his own back in Willow Creek, who he often thought about. He made sure to set aside some of his earnings to buy presents for them and for Susan whenever he had the chance to go back home. Life in the city, although a far cry from the farm, had settled into a pleasant rhythm. The job was easy enough and the pay was good. George was a diligent worker, always happy to lend a hand. He treated his younger colleagues with a kind of avuncular affection, and they, in turn, respected him. Being a creature of habit, George woke up early every morning, even in the city. He'd make himself a cup of coffee, have a cigarette, and heat up leftovers from the night before. Occasionally, he'd treat himself to a bowl of noodles from the stall down the street. By 8 o'clock, he'd be out front, sweeping the pavement and getting ready to open up the office. Jennifer was always the last to arrive, usually rushing in a few minutes late. But she was also the last to leave, always the dedicated executive, working late into the evening. Jennifer was a striking woman, tall and slender, her figure accentuated by her usual work attire of a black blazer and pantsuit or a skirt. She exuded an air of sophistication, but there was also a warmth to her smile that lit up her features, especially when her pearly white teeth flashed in a grin. She always arrived on her motorbike. George, with a knowing chuckle to himself, had noticed she wasn't one for wearing restrictive undergarments beneath those sleek outfits. He couldn't help but admire her long legs as she dismounted, handing him the keys with a casual, "Morning, George." Her white blouses, usually unbuttoned at the top, offered tantalizing glimpses of her cleavage. It was clear that some of the younger male employees harbored secret fantasies about their boss, but none dared to voice these thoughts aloud. Jennifer ran a tight ship, both literally and figuratively, and maintained a professional distance. Jennifer, unaware of the admiring glances following her every move up the stairs, moved through the office with an air of cool authority. While most of the staff respected her dedication and drive, some found her aloofness a tad intimidating. George, for his part, went about his duties with a quiet diligence. He'd spend his downtime near the gate, watching the traffic flow by, hands clasped behind his back. He'd buy lottery tickets from the local kids, always ready with a joke or a kind word for the little ones, who reminded him of his own grandkids. George, with his quick wit and easygoing nature, had always been popular with children. He'd run his fingers through his salt and pepper beard, a habit he'd cultivated over the years. It was a handsome beard, thick and well kept, a point of pride for the old farmer. He also couldn't help but notice those brief, tantalizing glimpses beneath Jennifer's skirts whenever she arrived on her motorbike each morning. It had started as an accident, a harmless quirk of fate, but it had become a guilty pleasure. Those fleeting glimpses of her legs, of the lacy edges of her lingerie, sent a jolt of unexpected excitement through him. And he had to admit, he rather enjoyed it. He knew it was a harmless indulgence, a secret only he was privy to, since Jennifer was always the last to arrive, long after the rest of the staff had settled into their routines. At the end of the day, once everyone had left and the office was empty, George would lock up and head to the kitchen to prepare his simple but flavorful, country-style dinner. He always made sure to time it so he could be at the gate, ready to open it for Jennifer when she finally called it a day. Once she'd left, he'd meticulously maneuver her motorbike from the kitchen to the front of the building, turning the handlebars just so, ensuring it was perfectly positioned for her arrival the next morning. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes about his character. And Jennifer, though she never commented on it, noticed these small acts of thoughtfulness. She had grown quite fond of her reliable old security guard. The days flowed by, and George settled into a comfortable routine at Market Research Inc. He had learned everyone's name, even developing a friendly rapport with some of the younger staff members who seemed to enjoy his good-natured humor. Jennifer trusted him enough to give him a key to her office so that he could let Mrs. Smith, the cleaning lady, in every month. George always made sure to keep an eye on the time when Mrs. Smith was there, ensuring she finished within the hour before everyone returned from lunch. He'd double-check that everything was in order, especially in Jennifer's office, before locking up again for the afternoon. With the day winding down and everyone gone, George would cook himself dinner, the aromas of his hometown recipes filling the little kitchen. After dinner, he'd make his way up to the rooftop terrace behind Jennifer's office for his nightly ritual. He enjoyed smoking a cigarette under the open sky, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the stuffy city streets. Up here, amidst the star-dusted darkness, he could almost imagine he was back on his farm. The scent of freshly tilled earth replacing the exhaust fumes, the sounds of crickets and frogs replacing the city's endless hum. He'd think of Susan, of the grandkids, a pang of longing tugging at his heart. But the city had its own kind of peace, and he found himself appreciating the quiet solitude. The rooftop hidden from view had become his sanctuary, a place to unwind and feel a sense of freedom. It was up here that he'd indulge in another nightly ritual: his evening bath. After finishing his cigarette, he'd fill a bucket with water from the tap and wash up, the familiar routine a comforting echo of his life back in Willow Creek. Because the rooftop at Market Research Inc. was slightly higher than the neighboring buildings, George had an unobstructed view of the surrounding houses. From his vantage point, he could hear the noisy banter of the workers in the packaging factory next door, their voices echoing through the night as they jostled for space in the shared bathroom. He'd glance over at the Wilsons' house, their lights usually dimmed by this hour, their evenings a stark contrast to the lively chaos of the young family living behind them. One evening, as George was making his way up to the rooftop for his usual bath, he was surprised by an unusual commotion coming from the family behind the Wilsons' place. It was a familiar sound, the playful shrieks and laughter of kids being kids, but tonight the noises were louder, more distinct. Curious, George moved towards the edge of the rooftop, peering down at the house below. He wasn't quite prepared for the sight that greeted him. It seemed someone had pulled back a curtain, probably to let in the evening light. But for George, it was like a stage curtain had been lifted, revealing an unexpected scene. The bathroom below was illuminated, and inside, two young girls, barely teenagers, were in the middle of a boisterous, soapy bath. They were oblivious to their audience, their giggles echoing in the night as they playfully lathered each other up, their only articles of clothing a pair of brightly colored panties. George stared, mesmerized, his breath catching in his throat. He felt a strange mix of guilt and fascination, his senses suddenly awakened by this unexpected glimpse into the private lives of the family next door. George froze, rooted to the spot, his gaze glued to the scene below. He hadn't been this close to a woman, let alone young women, in months. Being away from Susan, even if it was his choice, had left a certain emptiness. But seeing these carefree young things, their youthful exuberance on full display, stirred something deep within him. He felt a sudden surge of longing, a primal urge he hadn't felt in years. His eyes drank in every detail, emboldened by the cover of darkness. It became his nightly secret. Night after night, around 8 o'clock, he'd find himself drawn to the edge of the rooftop, his heart pounding with anticipation. The routine was always the same. First, the girls, their laughter echoing through the stillness, then the boys, their boisterous splashing, a stark contrast to their sisters. But the highlight of George's nightly show was Ashley, the young wife of the factory owner. Ashley, with her lush curves and playful sensuality, was a sight to behold. She liked to take long baths, the sound of her voice, playful and teasing, sometimes carrying over to where George stood hidden in the shadows. Through the frosted glass, he would catch glimpses of her, her wet skin gleaming under the harsh bathroom light, every movement a silent invitation. He felt a familiar ache, a heat that had nothing to do with the summer night. His pulse quickened the night he realized Ashley didn't bother with a stitch of clothing under the shower. It was almost too much for the old farmer to bear, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. He started timing his own bath to coincide with hers. He'd lean against the railing, his heart pounding like a drum, waiting for the familiar glow of the bathroom light to flicker on in the building next door. But one night, something was different. The house was unusually quiet. The children must have been away for the weekend, George mused. But then, to his surprise, he saw two figures silhouetted against the frosted glass. It was Ashley and her husband, together in the shower. George watched transfixed as they embraced, their bodies intertwined. A wave of heat coursed through him, followed by a chilling realization. He had become a peeping Tom, his fantasies fueled by stolen glimpses and the loneliness of a life lived too far from home. He had been so caught up in his own yearnings, in reliving a part of himself he thought was long gone, that he had forgotten himself. Ashley, of course, had no idea about her nightly admirer. She would greet George with a friendly hello whenever their paths crossed near the gate. But recently, she'd noticed his gaze lingering a little too long, his eyes a shade too curious. It made her uncomfortable, but she brushed it off, attributing it to the old man's eccentricities. From then on, George rarely missed his nightly rooftop ritual. His voyeuristic tendencies piqued by the unintended show next door. It was more entertaining than any TV program, and George found himself looking forward to it with a mix of anticipation and shame. It wasn't just Ashley and her family. George had also caught sight of the young daughter-in-law from the house on the other side, her changing figure a testament to her recent motherhood. He figured with the office building next door, no one would be watching. But as the days turned into weeks, George found his gaze drawn to a different kind of beauty, the mature elegance of Jennifer. He'd watch her as she emerged from the office, her long legs accentuated by her business attire, and a familiar heat would course through him, quickly tempered by a wave of guilt. He was a simple security guard, a grandfatherly figure. What was he thinking, harboring such thoughts about his employer? He'd brush it off, telling himself it was just a harmless distraction, a way to stave off the loneliness of his evenings away from Susan. After all, he thought, country women aged quickly, worn down by years of hard work and child-rearing. It wasn't as if he could expect anything from his wife after all these years. He'd find solace in the company of his old farmer friends whenever he returned to Willow Creek, their evenings spent sharing stories over shared bottles of wine. But the city, with its parade of youthful women, had awakened something in him, a yearning he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't tell if Jennifer was being deliberately provocative or if it was simply her way. Almost every day as she'd toss him her motorbike keys, he'd catch a glimpse of the lacy edges of her underwear, a flash of skin beneath her tailored skirts. And then there was the time she'd brought him a container of leftovers from dinner, food she and Sophia hadn't finished. George accepted gratefully, a little embarrassed by her generosity. From then on, Jennifer treated him less like an employee and more like a friend, addressing him as George instead of the more formal Mr. George. He learned that Mark, her husband, had been studying abroad for the past 2 years and was due to return at the end of the year. Their marriage, from what George could gather, was a happy one, but being apart had taken its toll on Jennifer. He sensed a yearning in her, a restlessness that whispered beneath her cool exterior. Despite her age, Jennifer was still an attractive woman. She maintained her figure with daily exercise, hitting the gym after work and attending yoga classes most mornings. George had overheard some of her gym buddies, their conversations a mix of gossip and knowing laughter, suggesting she should find a younger man to keep her warm at night. But Jennifer would just laugh it off, her focus firmly on work and family. Still, George sensed a simmering passion beneath her professional demeanor, a fire that was waiting to be rekindled. One afternoon, Jennifer found herself working later than usual. George was in the kitchen, already starting on his dinner preparations. They had fallen into an easy rapport over the past few months, and she felt comfortable enough around him to wander into the kitchen. "What smells so good, George?" she asked, her footsteps echoing lightly on the tile floor. George jumped, startled, nearly dropping the head of lettuce he'd been rinsing. He fumbled for words as Jennifer approached. "Oh, Miss Jennifer. Didn't hear you come in. Let me just," he began, his hand instinctively reaching for the gate remote. "No worries, George," she chuckled. "I just wanted to see what you were cooking up tonight. It smells delicious." George wiped the sweat from his brow, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "Oh, it's nothing special. Just a simple salad," he mumbled, embarrassed. Jennifer raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a knowing smile. "Living the simple life, are we, George? Saving all your money to send back home?" "Something like that, ma'am," he replied, his gaze dropping to the lettuce in the sink. He was about to excuse himself to change into something more appropriate when Jennifer spoke again. "Don't mind me, George. Why don't you finish up here? I'm in no hurry." The scent of George's sweat, a musky, masculine scent, hung in the air, mixing with the fragrance of Jennifer's expensive perfume. She found herself strangely drawn to it, her senses tingling with an unexpected awareness. George, dressed in a loose pair of shorts, his legs tanned and surprisingly muscular for a man his age, continued preparing his salad, his back to her. Jennifer averted her eyes, suddenly feeling a warmth spread through her. "You go on ahead, Miss Jennifer," George said, finally breaking the silence. "I'll lock up." "What else do you need to do? I can let myself out." "Well, I was going to." George hesitated, "to change into my pants, to lock up properly." Jennifer laughed softly, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Honestly, George, you're such a gentleman. It's fine, really." George blushed, flustered. "I don't feel right, Miss Jennifer, letting you leave with me still in my shorts." Jennifer sighed dramatically. "Suit yourself, George." As she made her way out of the kitchen, she tripped over a misplaced stool and went sprawling onto a stack of cushions George used for extra seating. "Ouch!" she exclaimed, her voice a mix of surprise and amusement. George, who ducked into the bathroom but hadn't yet had time to pull up his pants, rushed out at the sound of her cry. "Miss Jennifer, are you all right?" He reached down, pulling her up by the arms. "I'm fine, George," she chuckled, her cheeks flushed. "Just didn't see that stool." As George helped her up, his fingers brushed against her skin. The warmth of her touch, the intoxicating scent of her perfume, sent a jolt through him. He felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a primal urge he thought was long buried. For a moment, they simply stood there, George's hands still clasped around Jennifer's, her body a hair's breadth away. The air between them crackled with an unexpected energy. He led her gently to a chair at the small kitchen table, both of them suddenly acutely aware of the intimacy of the situation. "Are you sure you're okay, Miss Jennifer? Did you hurt yourself?" George asked, his voice laced with concern. He felt terrible. It was his fault she'd tripped. "It's fine, really, George," Jennifer reassured him, though her voice was a bit shaky. "I just didn't see that stool. I'm a bit clumsy sometimes. Let me get you some water." He moved quickly to the refrigerator, his hands trembling slightly. "Here. Drink this. Maybe you should sit for a few minutes before you head out." Jennifer took a sip of water, her eyes meeting George's over the rim of the glass. "Maybe I will," she murmured, suddenly feeling lightheaded. "Are you sure you're not hurt?" George pressed, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. "It was my fault, leaving that stool there." "It's just a scratch, really," she replied, gingerly touching her knee. "My skirt caught on the edge when I fell. Let me get some ointment. It'll help with the sting." Before Jennifer could protest, he was rummaging in the cupboard above the sink. "George, really, it's fine, you don't have to." But George was already back, a small tin of green ointment in his hand. Jennifer, her face flushed, resigned herself to his ministrations. He knelt down beside her, gently lifting the hem of her skirt to examine her knee. Under the dim kitchen light, he saw a small scrape, made redder by the contrast of her white lacy underwear. "There you go, Miss Jennifer," he said softly, his fingers gently dabbing the ointment onto her skin. "That should do the trick." Jennifer winced involuntarily, then bit back a gasp. She'd never had another man, other than her husband, tend to her so intimately. She watched as George, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin, carefully applied the ointment. He was so focused on his task, his brow furrowed in concentration, that he didn't notice her gaze drop to his lap. Her eyes widened as she realized that beneath those loose-fitting shorts, George was packing some serious equipment. She hadn't expected a man his age. Well, she couldn't deny a certain thrill ran through her at the discovery. He seemed to sense her gaze because he looked up, his cheeks flushing crimson. He cleared his throat, flustered. "Sorry, Miss Jennifer, It's fine, George," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. It feels better already." She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, suddenly aware of the heat radiating from him. "Maybe you should stay a little longer?" George found himself saying, his voice raspy. "Just to make sure you're all right." He wanted her to stay, wanted to savor this unexpected closeness, even if it was just for a few more stolen moments. And then, to his surprise, she said, "Maybe I will, George, just for a bit." It was the first time she'd addressed him by name without a Mr. or Ms. prefixed. A surge of boldness, fueled by a potent mix of alcohol and desire, coursed through him. Jennifer sipped the water George had placed in front of her, her mind replaying the events of the past few minutes. She felt a wave of shame wash over her. How could she, a successful, independent woman, be so easily disarmed by a simple farmer? Her senses set alight by the scent of his sweat, the unexpected firmness of his touch. She had fielded her fair share of advances over the years, gracefully deflecting each one with a cool smile and a firm no. She wasn't the type to succumb to such base desires, especially not with a man old enough to be her father. Yet here she was, her body tingling with an unfamiliar heat, her mind filled with images she couldn't quite shake off. As if sensing her discomfort, George stood up, giving her some space. "Well," he said, his voice gruff with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "Seems like you're doing better now, Miss Jennifer. I should go lock up." "Yes, of course, George," Jennifer replied, her composure returning. "Thank you for everything, and I'm sorry about the stool. I should have been more careful." She followed George down the hallway towards the front entrance, acutely aware of his presence behind her. There was a nervous energy in his movements, a hesitancy that both intrigued and excited her. At the gate, George fumbled with the lock, his eyes avoiding hers. Jennifer, emboldened by the encounter, offered a small smile, her eyes sparkling with a hint of mischief. He met her gaze for a fleeting moment, his own eyes filled with gratitude and something else, something that sent a shiver down her spine. George watched her drive away, her motorbike a white blur against the darkening sky. He went back inside, his mind and body still buzzing with the memory of her touch, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air. He'd never slept so soundly. Jennifer, on the other hand, found herself thinking about her encounter with George throughout the evening. She felt a wave of self-disgust wash over her as she hurried into the bathroom to change out of her work clothes. What was she thinking, letting an old man have such an effect on her? Was it simply a matter of her unmet needs, the natural urges of a woman her age deprived of physical intimacy? She thought of Mark, her husband, thousands of miles away. She loved him dearly, but the distance, the lack of physical touch, had left a void in her life. She tried to shake off the memory of George's hands on her skin by taking a long, hot shower, but it didn't seem to help. They resumed their usual routines at the office, their interactions a confusing mix of awkward silences and stolen glances. George, unsure of how to proceed, tried to maintain a professional distance, terrified of jeopardizing his job or worse, offending Jennifer. She, in turn, found herself drawn to him even more. The memory of their encounter, a delicious secret she replayed in her mind whenever she was alone. Jennifer found herself calling Mark more often, their conversations stretching late into the night, Chicago time. She'd fill him in on the details of her day, but the longing in her voice, the unspoken desire, hung heavy between them, unspoken but palpable. Ever since their close encounter in the kitchen, Jennifer had become acutely aware of her own needs, her body's responses to George's presence difficult to ignore. She'd find herself blushing at the most inopportune moments, the memory of his touch sending a pleasant shiver down her spine. She'd spent a restless night after their encounter, torn between a desire to forget the whole thing and a longing for something more. She told herself it was foolish, this attraction to a man old enough to be her father, a man who wasn't even her husband. She threw herself into her work, focusing on the imminent return of her husband, convincing herself that things would go back to normal once Mark was home. Yet, her daily interactions with George continued to unsettle her. She couldn't deny a certain fondness for the old farmer, his kindness, his quiet strength. But she knew she had to maintain a professional distance. There were boundaries, lines they shouldn't cross. Still, every evening, as he'd walk her motorbike out to the gate, their hands would brush, and she'd see a flicker of longing in his eyes, a mirror of her own unspoken desire. She knew he felt it too, the unspoken tension that simmered between them. George, emboldened by Jennifer's change in demeanor, started toying with the idea of making a move, of testing the waters to see if her feelings ran as deep as his. He knew it was a risky proposition, but the potential reward, the thought of her in his arms, was too tempting to resist. Besides, if things went south, the worst that could happen was that he'd lose his job. It was a risk he was willing to take, a secret they would keep between them. One evening, Jennifer arrived at the office earlier than usual. She needed to finish some paperwork before heading home to Sophia, who had a late music lesson. As she made her way to the kitchen to ask George to bring her motorbike around, she stopped short, her breath catching in her throat. George was standing by the stove, his back to her, his broad shoulders and muscular arms accentuated by the thin cotton of his striped tank top. Jennifer's mind flashed back to their encounter in the kitchen, remembering the surprising firmness of his grip, the unexpected strength of his hands. She'd had no idea the old man was so fit. Mark, despite being years younger, couldn't compare to the raw masculine energy that seemed to radiate from George. She was about to announce her presence, but something stopped her. She found herself moving closer, her steps almost soundless on the tiled floor. She watched him, mesmerized, as he stirred something in a pan, the scent of garlic and ginger filling the air. He was completely unaware of her presence, lost in his culinary world. She noticed how the muscles in his back moved beneath the thin fabric of his shirt, his movements efficient and graceful. "What smells so good, George?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur. George jumped, startled, spinning around to face her, a look of panic flashing across his face. "Miss Jennifer, I didn't hear you come in." He quickly grabbed his shirt from the back of a chair, fumbling to pull it on. Jennifer laughed, her cheeks warm with a blush she couldn't quite hide. "Relax, George. It's just me. You didn't have to get all dressed up on my account." He gave a nervous chuckle, his hand running self-consciously over his beard. "Well, I thought, it's not appropriate." "Don't worry about it, George," she interrupted, her gaze lingering on his arms for a beat too long. "I just came down to ask you to bring my motorbike around. I have to leave early tonight." Burst that. "Right, of course, Miss Jennifer. One motorbike coming right up." He turned to grab his keys, relief washing over him. Jennifer, wanting to prolong their exchange, moved towards the refrigerator. "I'm a little hungry," she lied. "Is there anything in there to snack on?" She leaned over, pretending to peer into the fridge, her body angled so that George had a clear view of her backside. She felt his gaze on her, hot and intense, and a thrill shot through her. She had to bite back a moan. "Find anything interesting in there, Miss Jennifer?" George asked, his voice raspy with a desire he couldn't quite hide. Jennifer straightened up, turning to face him, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "Not really, George," she purred, her voice husky with a double meaning he couldn't miss. "You know how I am, always watching my figure." George felt a surge of confidence. He'd misread her signals after all. She was interested. He took a step closer, his gaze meeting hers. "I could make you something to eat," he offered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, George," she sighed dramatically, "you're such a tease." She paused, letting the unspoken question hang in the air between them. "I really should be going. Sophia's expecting me." She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe she was doing this, flirting with an employee, a man old enough to be her father. And yet, a part of her, a part she'd kept hidden for far too long, craved his touch, his attention. She turned to leave, her steps slow and deliberate, giving him one last lingering look over her shoulder. "Good night, George," she said, her voice barely audible. George figured that was enough for one night. He didn't want to push his luck, especially not with a woman like Jennifer. Women, he had learned, were complicated creatures, their desires a mystery even to themselves. They might be burning with passion on the inside, yet maintain a cool facade, their true feelings hidden behind a wall of propriety. He sensed that Jennifer was tempted, that beneath her professional exterior, a fire was smoldering, waiting to be ignited. He would give her time, let things unfold naturally. There was no rush. As if to confirm his thoughts, Jennifer turned back to him, a hesitant smile on her lips. "Actually, George," she said, her voice softer than usual, "could I trouble you for a glass of water? I'm a little parched." George's heart skipped a beat. The way she said his name, the sweetness in her voice, it was like music to his ears. He was certain now. She was playing his game. He just needed to make the next move, reel her in gently, and he'd have his prize. He'd been right to play it cool, to let her come to him. He poured her a glass of water, his hand steady despite the tremor of excitement coursing through him. He took a seat beside her at the table, their knees almost touching. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice husky with concern. "You seemed a little out of sorts just now." Jennifer laughed, a nervous flutter in her chest. "It's nothing, George, really," she said, suddenly unsure of how to address him. She felt like a schoolgirl, her composure shattered by his nearness. "I'm just a little tired, that's all." He smiled, his eyes twinkling with understanding. "A hard day at the office?" "You could say that," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Their conversation, usually formal and polite, had taken on a new intimacy. Their words charged with unspoken meaning. "Did you put any ointment on that scratch?" he asked, his eyes dropping to her knee. Jennifer blushed, the memory of his touch sending a shiver through her. "It's fine, really," she said quickly, her fingers tightening around the glass of water. She finished the water quickly, eager to escape the confines of the kitchen, the intensity of his gaze. She stood up, her legs shaky beneath her, and headed for the door. George followed, his eyes glued to the sway of her hips beneath her skirt. She paused at the gate, her back to him, pulling on her gloves. As she did, George caught a glimpse of her hand, her wedding ring catching the light. He felt a pang of guilt, quickly followed by a surge of determination. He had come this far. He wasn't going to back down now. He'd tasted desire again, felt the fire rekindled in his blood. He watched as she drove away, her motorbike disappearing into the night, and he knew with a certainty that defied logic that this was just the beginning. He continued his nightly rooftop vigils, his voyeuristic tendencies now an addiction he couldn't seem to shake. But tonight, there was a new urgency to his need. A restlessness that no amount of stolen glances could satisfy. Jennifer, true to her word, started leaving the office earlier than usual. She'd make excuses. Extra work to catch up on, errands to run, appointments that didn't really exist. The truth was, she craved the heat of his gaze, the unspoken promise in his eyes. She told herself it was madness, this attraction to a man so different from her, a man who represented everything she'd left behind in her pursuit of a successful, independent life. But some nights, even the memory of her husband's touch, their whispered conversations over the phone, couldn't quell the fire that George had ignited in her blood. One evening, she found herself lingering in the kitchen, drawn by the familiar scent of his cooking. She stood there for a moment, watching him prepare his dinner. He was dressed in his usual after-work attire, a pair of faded shorts and a thin tank top, his gray hair damp from his nightly bath. She had never paid much attention to his appearance before, but tonight she saw him with new eyes. He might be older, she thought, but there was a strength to his features, a rugged masculinity that she found undeniably appealing. She cleared her throat, announcing her presence. "I see it's getting to be a habit, George," she said, a playful lilt to her voice. "You and your early dinners." George turned, his face breaking into a wide grin when he saw her standing there. His heart quickened. She was earlier than usual, and this time he sensed it wasn't just about the motorbike. "Miss Jennifer," he began, his voice catching in his throat. "It's good to see you. What brings you down here this evening?" Jennifer smiled, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "I was just wondering," she began, her gaze lingering on his face, "if it's been a while since you've had a home-cooked meal?" George felt a jolt of hope, of course, through him. Was she suggesting? No, he couldn't let himself hope. And yet, the way she looked at him, the warmth in her voice, it was as intoxicating as the strongest rice wine. Jennifer, encouraged by his silence, continued, her voice a husky murmur. "It's just that. Well, it's been a while since I've had someone to share a meal with." She paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. We could talk about things. Things? George echoed, his heart pounding in his chest. Jennifer laughed, a throaty sound that sent shivers down his spine. Yes, George, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Things. And in that moment, as their eyes met across the small kitchen table, the air thick with unspoken desire, they both knew that their lives were about to change forever. George felt his heart leap into his throat. She was playing his game, and it was driving him crazy. He pulled his chair closer to Jennifer's, his voice a low rumble as he replied. To be honest with you, Miss Jennifer, it's my grandkids I miss the most. A sly smile spread across Jennifer's lips. Oh, is that right? And not, say, your wife? George felt a blush creep up his neck. He wasn't used to this kind of banter, especially not with a woman like Jennifer. Well, you see, ma'am, I'm an old man now. Old, huh? Jennifer chuckled, enjoying his flustered demeanor. Don't sell yourself short, George. You seem pretty strong to me. George felt a thrill run through him at her words, his body responding to her playful teasing in a way he thought was long gone. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze lingering on her face, on the curve of her lips, the way her eyes seemed to sparkle with mischief. You can't fool me, George, she said, her voice dropping to a husky whisper. I've seen the way you look at me. I know what you're thinking. I don't know what you mean, Miss Jennifer, he stammered, his heart pounding in his chest. Jennifer leaned closer, her fingers brushing against his arm. Don't play coy with me, George, she murmured, her voice thick with desire. You're a man, and I'm a woman, and sometimes a woman needs a man, if you know what I mean. George felt a wave of heat surge through him. He had been right. She wanted him. This sophisticated, successful woman, she wanted him just as much as he wanted her. He was about to make a move to pull her closer when she sat back, her eyes twinkling with a mixture of desire and apprehension. I need a glass of water, she said breathlessly, her composure momentarily shattered. This heat is unbearable. George watched, mesmerized, as she raised the glass to her lips, her throat working as she swallowed. He wanted to reach out, to trace his fingers along the delicate line of her jaw, to feel the warmth of her skin beneath his rough hands. Maybe you should sit for a bit, he suggested, his voice hoarse, just to be safe. Jennifer nodded, her eyes downcast. She couldn't believe she was allowing this to happen, letting this old farmer, this nobody, see her unravel like this. She thought of Mark, her husband, and felt a pang of guilt. She stood up, her legs wobbly, and headed for the door. I should go, she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. Of course, Miss Jennifer, George said, his voice filled with a tenderness that surprised him. Let me walk you out. He followed her out to the gate, his eyes glued to the sway of her hips as she walked. He longed to touch her, to feel the heat of her body pressed against his, but he knew he had to restrain himself. For now, he'd made his move, planted the seed. Now, he had to wait for it to grow. He watched as she drove away, her motorbike disappearing into the night. He went back inside, his head spinning with possibilities. He had a feeling that it wouldn't be long now. As she drove home that night, Jennifer was awash in a sea of conflicting emotions. Shame and guilt gnawed at her conscience. What was she thinking? Flirting with George like that? She barely knew the man, and yet she couldn't deny the electric jolt that ran through her every time their eyes met, the way her body seemed to crave his touch. She vowed to put a stop to this foolishness, to focus on her work and her impending reunion with Mark. It was just a silly crush, a symptom of her loneliness, she told herself. George, on the other hand, felt his confidence growing with each passing day. He noticed how Jennifer seemed to seek him out more often, engaging him in conversations about his life back in Willow Creek, about Susan and the grandkids. He became her confidant, a willing ear to her unspoken frustrations. She, in turn, seemed to find solace in his presence, her usual reserve melting away whenever she was around him. He knew better than to push his luck. He had to play this carefully, let their unspoken desires simmer beneath the surface of their everyday interactions. Still, he couldn't help but steal a lingering glance at her figure as she bent over her desk, the scent of her perfume filling him with a longing that was both exhilarating and terrifying. He was playing with fire, and he knew it. One afternoon, Jennifer found herself seeking out his company yet again. They were alone in the office, the usual afternoon lulls stretching before them. She wandered into the kitchen, drawn as if by a magnet to his quiet presence. George, sensing her arrival, turned from the counter where he was preparing his usual pre-dinner coffee. "Miss Jennifer," he greeted her, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "You're early today? Is everything all right?" Jennifer sighed, her shoulders slumping with a weariness that had nothing to do with work. "Just another day at the office, George," she replied, her voice laced with a weariness he'd never heard before. "Sometimes I wonder if it's all worth it, all this work, this responsibility." She paused, her gaze meeting his with a vulnerability that made his heart ache. "It gets lonely sometimes." He understood her meaning, the unspoken longing that resonated between them. He crossed the room, pulling a chair out for her at the small kitchen table. "Tell me about it," he said gently, his hand lingering on her shoulder for a beat too long. "Is your husband coming home anytime soon?" Jennifer's eyes fluttered closed at his touch, a wave of longing washing over her. "Not for a while," she whispered, her voice thick with unspoken desire. "He still has a few months left in England." George's hand moved to her back, his fingers gently stroking her skin. "That's a long time to be apart," he murmured, his voice husky with an emotion he couldn't quite contain. "It is," she breathed, her body leaning into his touch. She had never felt so seen by anyone, not even her own husband. "You know," he began, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "A woman like you." "A woman like me?" she echoed, her breath hitching in her throat. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "A woman like you, she has needs." Jennifer's eyes fluttered closed as a wave of heat surged through her. "And what makes you think you understand my needs, George?" she whispered, her voice a mixture of challenge and surrender. He pulled back slightly, his gaze holding hers. "Let me show you," he breathed, his voice rough with desire. And then, before she could protest, before her mind could catch up with her traitorous body, his lips were on hers, his rough hand cupping her face, pulling her closer. His gaze fell on the top button of her blouse, the one that always seemed to be straining against the fabric, a silent invitation to the men in her office, men who wouldn't dare cross the line. But George, emboldened by her vulnerability, by the unspoken desire that simmered between them, was no longer content with stolen glances and fleeting touches. It was as if she sensed his gaze on her, the heat of his desire burning into her skin. She sat up straighter, her fingers toying with the top button of her blouse. "George," she began, her voice a husky whisper, I need to leave now. Could you get my motorbike, please?" "Of course, Miss Jennifer," he replied, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite place. He couldn't believe how easily she'd succumbed to his silent command, how effortlessly she played into his fantasy. He was hooked. "Actually," she said, her voice softer now, "why don't I stay a little longer?" "Stay?" he echoed, his heart pounding against his ribs. Was she serious? Had his unspoken desires finally worn her down? She smiled, a slow, seductive curve of her lips that sent a shiver down his spine. "Don't get too excited, George," she purred. "Sophia's expecting me home for dinner, but maybe another time?" He watched, his blood on fire, as she walked towards the door, her hips swaying with each graceful step. She paused at the threshold, her back to him, and for a moment he thought she might change her mind. "Good night, George," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He stood there for a long moment, his body thrumming with a mixture of anticipation and frustration, before turning back to the kitchen. He had her right where he wanted her. It was only a matter of time. The next few days were pure torture for George. He replayed their encounter in his mind, her scent, her laughter, the feel of her skin against his, a constant torment. He couldn't concentrate on his work, his usual voyeuristic pleasures, now a pale imitation of the real thing. He wasn't sure if Jennifer was deliberately toying with him or if she was genuinely conflicted, but her behavior was driving him crazy. She seemed to be everywhere he looked, her laughter echoing in the hallway, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air long after she'd left for the day. One evening, as he was preparing his dinner, he heard a soft noise at the kitchen door. He turned, his heart leaping into his chest, hoping, praying. And there she was, standing in the doorway, her eyes shining with a mischievous glint. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, her lips painted a vibrant red, her dress hugging her curves in all the right places. She tiptoed into the room, her finger pressed to her lips. "Don't say anything, George," she whispered, her voice husky with a desire that mirrored his own. He watched, speechless, as she made her way towards him, her movements graceful and deliberate. She stopped just inches away, her body a hair's breadth from his. "What are you doing here, Miss Jennifer?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Shh," she murmured, her fingers tracing a path along his jawline. "Just call me Jennifer." Jennifer felt her mouth go dry as she watched George, his hands deftly peeling the potatoes. She was suddenly acutely aware of his presence, of the heat radiating from his body. "Here, George," she said, her voice a shaky whisper. "Let me help you with that." "Oh, there's no need, Miss Jennifer. I'm almost finished." "Nonsense," she insisted, her fingers reaching out to take the knife from his hand. "I'm perfectly capable of peeling a few potatoes." She sat down beside him on the floor, her skirt riding up her thighs as she leaned forward. George, his gaze glued to the smooth expanse of her legs, felt a familiar tightness in his groin. He watched as she took the knife, her long, slender fingers surprisingly adept at the task. He couldn't help but notice the way her blouse gaped open as she leaned forward, revealing a tantalizing glimpse of cleavage. He was hard as a rock, and he knew she could feel it, the heat of his desire pressing against her. "So, George," she asked, her voice playful, "have you been thinking about taking a vacation anytime soon? I could probably find someone to cover for you." He was surprised by her question. "A vacation?" he echoed, his mind scrambling to keep up. "Well, I'm not sure. It's a long trip back to Willow Creek and you want to see your wife, of course," she finished for him, her voice thick with a knowing smile. "Well, it's more about the grandkids, really," he stammered, his cheeks flushing. "Susan, she's not as young as she used to be." Jennifer laughed, a throaty sound that sent shivers down his spine. "Oh, George, you're such a charmer," she purred, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Don't tell me you're too old for that kind of thing." "Well, a farmer's work is hard work," he countered, trying to regain some of his lost composure. "It takes its toll on a man, you know." "Really?" She leaned closer, her breath tickling his ear. "I'd say you're holding up pretty well, all things considered." He felt a surge of confidence at her words, his hand instinctively reaching out to touch hers. "What about you, Miss Jennifer?" he asked, his voice husky with a desire he could no longer hide. "Do you ever miss it?" "Miss what, George?" she asked, her eyes locking onto his. "You know, the intimacy. Being with a man." "Oh, George," she sighed, her voice barely a whisper. "You ask such dangerous questions." "I'm just curious," he said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "A woman like you, I can't imagine you being alone for so long." She laughed, a nervous flutter in her chest. "You'd be surprised, George," she said, her gaze dropping to his lap. She'd noticed his arousal, the way his shorts strained against his obvious desire, and a thrill shot through her. "Even a strong, capable woman like me, she has needs." "So what do you do?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "How do you cope?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a longing that mirrored his own. I improvise," she whispered. "And how is that working out for you?" He pressed, his fingers tightening around hers. "Not very well, to be honest," she admitted, her voice thick with desire. "But what am I supposed to do? I'm a married woman. I have responsibilities." "Responsibilities," he scoffed. "That's what they all say." "What do you mean, George?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Just that. I've seen how women like you operate," he said, his voice a low growl. "You think you can have it all, the career, the family, the perfect life. But you forget that you're still a woman, with needs, with desires." "And what do you know about women like me, George?" she challenged, her gaze fixed on his. He leaned closer, his breath hot on her cheek. "More than you think, Miss Jennifer," he murmured, his fingers tracing a path along her bare arm. "I can see right through you. You might be all business on the outside, but underneath." "Underneath what, George?" she breathed, her body trembling with anticipation. "Underneath, you're just a woman, longing to be touched, to be loved." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. "Let me show you how good it can be, Jennifer," he whispered, his voice rough with desire. "Let me take care of you." Jennifer, her senses overwhelmed by his scent, by the heat radiating from his body, closed her eyes and leaned into his touch. It had been so long since she'd felt this alive, this desired. For a fleeting moment, she forgot about Mark, about her responsibilities, about everything except the man whose touch was setting her soul on fire. "George," she whispered, her voice a plea, a surrender. "Please." He pulled her closer, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was both tender and demanding. She melted against him, her body responding with an urgency that shocked her. "Oh God, George," she moaned, her fingers tangling in his hair. "I need you, so much." He lifted her into his arms, carrying her as if she weighed nothing, and laid her gently on the small cot he kept in the corner of the kitchen for his afternoon naps. Their clothes came off in a frenzy of need, their bodies entwined in a desperate embrace. Time ceased to exist as they explored each other with a hunger that had been building for years. She was everything he had ever dreamed of, her body a perfect symphony of curves and softness. And she, lost in the heat of his touch, the strength of his arms around her, felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known was possible. Afterwards, as they lay entangled in the sheets, their bodies still damp with sweat, Jennifer felt a surge of panic. What had she done? She had betrayed her husband, her vows, everything she held dear. But even as the guilt threatened to overwhelm her, she couldn't deny the sense of satisfaction, the feeling of completeness she hadn't realized she was missing. "We have to stop this, George," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is wrong. I have a husband. I can't do this anymore." George pulled her close, his fingers tracing a path along her bare arm. "I know, Jennifer," he murmured, his voice husky with regret. "But it feels so right." "I know," she sighed, her body betraying her words as she nestled closer to him. "But it's just complicated." "I understand," he said, his lips brushing against her forehead. "But I don't want to lose you, Jennifer, not now that I've found you." I don't know what to say, George," she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. "This was a mistake. I should go." She disentangled herself from his embrace, her movements hesitant, her body reluctant to leave the warmth of his touch. "Don't go, Jennifer," he pleaded, his voice rough with emotion. "Stay with me." She hesitated for a moment, her heart torn between her desire and her conscience. "I can't, George," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But maybe another time." And with that she was gone, leaving him alone with his thoughts, his heart aching with a longing that he knew would never be fully satisfied. Jennifer felt a wave of pure joy wash over her. She had rediscovered a part of herself she thought was lost forever, a passion, a vibrancy she hadn't felt in years. The old cot in the corner of George's kitchen, a relic from his bachelor days, had become their sanctuary, a place where they could shed their inhibitions, their societal roles, and simply be two people, hungry for each other's touch. They had spent the past 2 hours lost in a whirlwind of passion, their bodies moving together in a rhythm that was both familiar and exhilarating. 7 times she had climaxed, each wave of pleasure washing away the years, the loneliness, the unspoken yearnings. As she looked at George, his face flushed with exertion, a contented smile on his lips, she realized he looked younger, more alive than she had ever seen him. But as the afterglow faded, a sense of reality crept in. This couldn't last, she knew. She had a husband, a daughter, a life she couldn't simply abandon. This had been a stolen moment, a delicious taste of forbidden fruit, but she knew she had to put a stop to it before things went too far. Back at the office, she found it difficult to concentrate on her work. Her daily phone calls with Mark, once a source of comfort, now felt strained, her mind filled with images of George, the memory of his touch a constant ache. She found herself yearning for him, for the raw, unbridled passion they had shared. She couldn't believe she was capable of such feelings, especially for a man so much older, a man so different from the sophisticated, successful men she usually gravitated towards. She was terrified of getting caught, of the scandal that would erupt if anyone discovered their affair. Mark, with his connections, his position in society, would be devastated. And she, her reputation tarnished, her career in ruins, would be left with nothing. No, she thought, this had to end. She had to find a way to break things off with George, gently, without hurting him too badly. He was a good man, a kind man, and she genuinely cared for him. But this was madness, a dangerous game they couldn't afford to play. She decided to take a different approach. She would be kind, understanding, but firm. They were both adults, after all, and they could handle this maturely. "We need to talk, George," she said softly one evening, her voice trembling slightly. This can't go on." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. "I know, Jennifer," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But it's not that easy, is it?" "No, it's not," she agreed, her gaze dropping to her lap. "But we have to be realistic. You have a wife, I have a husband. We both have lives, responsibilities." "What about our needs, Jennifer?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "What about what we feel for each other?" "It doesn't matter, George," she said, her voice sharp with a desperation she couldn't hide. "This is wrong. We're playing with fire and someone's going to get hurt. I won't let that happen." "So, that's it then?" he asked, his voice hollow with defeat. "We just pretend this never happened?" She reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. "We'll find a way, George," she said, her voice softening. "We'll be discreet, careful. We're both adults, we can handle this." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers for a sign, a glimmer of hope. "You're right, Jennifer," he said finally, a resigned smile spreading across his lips. "We'll find a way." He pulled her close, his arms encircling her in a warm embrace. "We'll be okay," he whispered, his lips brushing against her hair. And for a moment, as she felt the warmth of his body against hers, the scent of his familiar aftershave filling her senses, she allowed herself to believe him. They would find a way. They had to. This, whatever it was they had found together, was too precious to lose. As George sits alone, reflecting on the path he's taken, he realizes that life is often more complicated than we imagine. The connection he found with Jennifer was unexpected, stirring emotions he thought had long faded. But in the quiet moments, he understands that some lines should never be crossed, and not all desires are meant to be fulfilled. With a heavy heart, George knows it's time to let go and return to the simpler life he once knew, leaving behind the brief, bittersweet chapter that changed him forever. Life moves on, but the memories linger, reminding him that even in the twilight of life, the heart remains a mystery.